"Don't touch her," someone shouted. The black waitress stood between the billionaire and the truth. His hand froze inches from her face. The billionaire's polished fingers trembled, the first time in 30 years anyone had dared stop him. She stood there in her black waitress uniform, dirt under her fingernails, staring at the man whose eyes had gone pale. Recognition. Fear. Something she'd been waiting for her entire life. "You don't know me," he whispered, stepping back. "I know exactly who you are," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I've known since I was 7 years old." The security guards moved toward her, but stopped. Something in her stance, the way she held herself, made even them hesitate. She wasn't begging. She wasn't angry. She was certain, and certainty, they'd learned, was more dangerous than rage. "My mother worked for you," the waitress continued. 23 years ago, room 412 at the Peninsula Hotel. You were different then, younger. You promised her things." His jaw clenched. "I don't know what you're talking about." "She died last month," the waitress said flatly. "Pneumonia, alone in a shelter. And you know what she kept? A photograph, a picture of you holding me when I was 3 days old. You were smiling like I was the most important thing in the world." The billionaire's face had gone gray. Around them, the restaurant fell silent. Other diners watched, phones already rising to capture what they sensed was about to explode. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice cracked. I would have known." "You would have cared," she corrected, "if you'd wanted to. But you chose money instead. You chose your empire, your image, your lie instead of her. Instead of me." He looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. The denial crumbled. In her eyes and her jawline, the stubborn tilt of her chin, he saw echoes of someone he'd spent decades erasing from his memory. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. She smiled, cold, bitter, victorious. "The truth." Finally. Outside the restaurant windows, the city glittered below them. Neither of them knew that in exactly 30 seconds, a video of this moment would go viral. Neither of them knew that the woman filming from the corner table was a journalist. Neither of them knew that everything, his reputation, his legacy, his secrets, was about to detonate. But what neither of them suspected was the identity of the person who'd sent her to find him. Before we go further, comment where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. May today bring you joy and blessings. But to understand how we got here, we have to go back 15 years earlier. Marcus Sterling stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a conquered kingdom. At 35, he'd built an empire worth $4.7 billion real estate, tech, finance. He'd touched everything and turned it to gold. His photo hung in Forbes. His name opened doors in every major city on earth. But Marcus had a rule. He never looked back. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Sterling, your 2 p.m. is here. Send them in," he said, not turning from the window. The door opened. A woman entered, late 20s, beautiful in the way that made men careless. Her name was Simone. She'd been a maid at his Peninsula Hotel property. They'd met during an inspection. He'd noticed her because she was different, clever, sharp, unimpressed by his wealth. That had intrigued him. What followed was what always followed. A brief affair, promises he had no intention of keeping, and then distance. He remembered her laugh. It had been genuine, not the calculated giggle of women who wanted his money, but a real, unguarded laugh that made him feel alive. He remembered the way she'd looked at him in those early days, before the lies piled up, before the coldness set in. She'd challenged him. She'd made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could be something more than what he was. But that was dangerous. Feeling was dangerous. Connection was dangerous. So he'd buried those memories and moved on to the next conquest, the next deal, the next thrill. Until now. "I'm pregnant," Simone said, standing in front of his desk like she had every right to be there. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd prepared for this moment 100 times in his head. "That's not my responsibility." "She's yours," Simone said flatly. "I know because there's been no one else. I know because you were careless. And I know because—" her voice cracked slightly, "because I need help, and you're the only person in my life with any power." He stood up, creating distance, a power move. His expensive chair rolled backward silently. "I don't know you, Simone. What we had was—" 3 months, she interrupted. 3 months where you said you loved me. 3 months where you talked about building a life. 3 months where you made me believe. I was lying, Marcus said coldly. That's what I do. I lie. I take what I want, and I leave. You knew what this was. Simone's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She was tougher than that. Her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. I didn't know you were a coward. The words landed like a physical blow. For a second, just 1 second, Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. Guilt, responsibility, the weight of a human life depending on his choice, the echo of who he could have been if he'd had the courage to be better. He crushed it. He turned away, unable to face the hope dying in her eyes. He couldn't afford hope. Hope was weakness. Hope led to feelings, and feelings led to the one thing Marcus Sterling had spent his entire life avoiding: accountability. I'll give you money, he said, walking to his desk and writing a check with a steady hand. His signature was sharp, aggressive, final. Enough to start over, enough to raise a child, comfortably. But I won't be involved. I won't be a father. And if you ever tell anyone about this, I'll deny it. I have lawyers who will bury you. He tore the check from his leather-bound book and slid it across the polished mahogany surface toward her. $50,000. It was nothing to him. A rounding error in his quarterly earnings, but to her, it would be everything. He knew that, and it made him feel nothing. Simone looked at the check, $50,000, and her face hardened into something he didn't recognize. Not anger, worse, acceptance. The kind of acceptance that comes when all your hopes shatter and you finally understand. This man is not going to change. He is incapable of it. He will never be what you thought he was. One day, she said quietly, her voice hollow now, she's going to ask about you, and I'm going to tell her the truth. I'm going to tell her that her father is a man who buys his way out of responsibility, that he chose his money over her life, that he was given a chance to be something better, and he ran. Believe what you want, Marcus said, turning back to the window, unable to face her anymore. The city sprawled below him, indifferent. Just do it far away from me. She left. He never saw her again. He told himself it was over. He told himself he'd done the right thing, protected his empire, his reputation, his future. He buried the guilt under more deals. He smothered the doubt under more conquests. He built higher. He conquered more. He became untouchable. What he didn't know was that Simone had kept the photograph, the one of him in the hospital holding their newborn daughter, his face transformed by wonder. She kept it in a frame by her bed through all those years of working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, whispering the truth to a child. What he didn't know was that she'd raised their daughter alone, working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night, whispering the truth to a child who grew up asking why her father's name was never mentioned. What he didn't know was that their daughter, that girl, had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Every shift, every sleepless night, every moment of hunger and cold and loneliness, she was preparing. And what Marcus Sterling absolutely didn't know was that Simone, dying in that shelter with pneumonia ravaging her lungs, had made one final choice. She'd hired a private investigator. She'd given her daughter an address. She'd given her a mission. She'd given her a weapon. 5 years later. Her name was Emma. She was 20 years old, and she'd spent every single day of her conscious life preparing for this moment. She worked 3 jobs. The waitressing gig at the upscale restaurant downtown was the one that mattered. She'd chosen it specifically because Marcus Sterling ate there every Thursday. She knew his schedule better than he did. She knew he always sat in the corner booth. She knew he ordered the same thing: grilled salmon, no sides, 1 glass, of expensive wine that cost more than her entire day's wages. She knew everything about him except what she needed most: acknowledgement. The night before her first shift at the restaurant, Emma had sat on her mother's hospital bed. Simone was already fading. The pneumonia had done its work. Her mother's hand felt like paper in hers, fragile as a bird's wing, and Emma was terrified that if she held on too tight, her mother would shatter completely. "When you see him," Simone whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the machines keeping her alive. "Don't expect anything. He's not capable of giving. He only takes." Then why did you tell me to find him? Emma asked, her voice shaking. Tears were already streaming down her face, and her mother hadn't even died yet. Why would you do that to me, Mom? Because, Simone said, squeezing her daughter's hand with surprising strength, the last of her power concentrated in that gesture. You deserve to know that your existence mattered, that you were loved by someone once, even if he forgot. And because... She coughed, a wet, terrible sound that rattled in her chest. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear. Simone died 3 days later. Emma was working a double shift when the hospital called. She missed her mother's last breath by 40 minutes. She'd been serving appetizers to drunk investment bankers while her mother took her final breath alone. She left Emma 3 things: the photograph, the investigator's report, and a letter sealed in an envelope with Emma's name written in her mother's shaky handwriting. Emma didn't open the letter until she was standing outside the restaurant on her first night, terrified and determined, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tear open the envelope. It read, "My darling girl, I won't be there to see it, but I know you will survive this. You will walk into that restaurant. You will serve him. And one day, he will see you. And when he does, don't let him look away. Make him face what he abandoned. Make him understand that we mattered. Make him understand that you mattered. I love you. Mom." Emma had read those words 1,000 times since. She'd memorized them. She'd whispered them to herself on nights when exhaustion threatened to break her. They were her armor. They were her fuel. 3 months passed. 90 days of serving Marcus Sterling coffee. 90 days of him never once looking at her face, really looking, not just glancing through her like she was furniture. 90 days of watching him conduct business deals with men in expensive suits, seduce women who thought they were special, and live a life completely untouched by consequence or guilt or any of the human emotions that plagued ordinary people. It made her furious. The anger was fuel. It was oxygen. It was the only thing keeping her going through 16-hour shifts and sleepless nights. Every time he snapped his fingers and she brought him what he wanted without complaint, the rage grew. Every time he left a tip without making eye contact, it festered like an infected wound. Every time he laughed with another woman while Emma served him, it reminded her that her mother had been erased so completely that he didn't even know she existed. She told herself she was building a case, evidence, documenting patterns. But really, she was building something darker, a plan, a strategy. A moment where she would finally make him see what he'd done. She'd memorized his patterns. She knew that Thursdays were his preferred night because he liked to conduct business deals over dinner. It made him feel powerful. She knew his favorite table. She knew he never looked at the waitstaff because to him, they were invisible. They were service workers beneath his notice, incapable of mattering. That was his weakness. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. Marcus came in, but he wasn't alone. He had a young woman with him, couldn't have been more than 22. She was nervous, her leg bouncing under the table, her eyes wide with the kind of wonder that comes from thinking you've just met someone special. She was clearly impressed, clearly falling for whatever lies he was telling her about his business empire and his vision for the future. Emma watched him work. The charm was practiced, almost mechanical. The attention was calculated. He'd lean in at exactly the right moments, make eye contact, ask about her dreams and her fears, make her feel like she was the most important thing in his universe. The promises came next. Dinners at better restaurants, introductions to important people, maybe even a job at one of his companies. He was writing a story with her, making her the heroine, and she was eating it up because she wanted to believe. Emma had seen this before. Not just with her mother, but with the other waitresses, the hostesses, the women who worked at his hotels. She'd heard the stories from women in the shelter where her mother had spent her final weeks. He moved through women like he moved through money, collecting them, using them, discarding them when they were no longer useful or when something younger and fresher caught his eye. Something snapped in Emma. She walked to his table. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were trembling. She was supposed to just refill his water, a simple, invisible task. Instead, she stopped. The restaurant around her seemed to quiet. Other diners sensed something was happening. "You're beautiful when you lie," Emma said to the young woman, her voice quiet but steady, filled with more power than any scream could carry. "He's a master at it. He'll promise you forever. He'll make you feel like the most important thing in his life. He'll tell you things he's never told anyone else. And then, when you become inconvenient, when you ask for something real like commitment or honesty, he'll erase you like you never existed. He'll move on to someone younger, someone more impressed, someone who doesn't ask questions." The young woman stared at her, confused, trying to process what was happening. Emma could see her mind working, trying to reconcile what she was hearing with the perfect man sitting across from her. Marcus's face went dark. His jaw clenched. For the first time, Emma saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition? Fear? She couldn't tell. "Get away from this table," he said coldly, his voice like ice. "You're fired." Emma felt a wave of liberation wash over her. "Good," she said. "I quit anyway." But as she walked away, she felt his eyes on her. For the first time in 3 months, she'd made him see her, not as a waitress, not as invisible, as a threat. What neither of them knew was that the woman Marcus had been with, her name was Rebecca, worked as a freelance journalist investigating corporate malfeasance and patterns of abuse. What they didn't know was that she'd recorded that entire conversation on her phone. And what Marcus absolutely didn't know was that this wasn't the end of Emma's plan. It was just the beginning. Because the next morning, Rebecca would reach out to Emma, and together they would uncover something that would make Marcus Sterling's blood run cold. Evidence. Decades of it. Women he'd used, children he'd abandoned, a pattern so clear and so damning that no amount of money could bury it. But first, Emma had to get close enough to deliver the final blow. And that meant getting inside his world. 3 weeks later, Emma stood outside Marcus Sterling's penthouse building, her heart hammering in her chest. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. 1,000 times she'd whispered the words, practiced the inflection, imagined his face, and anticipated every possible response. She'd run through scenarios in her mind until they felt like memories. But no amount of rehearsal could prepare her for the reality. She'd gotten his private number through Rebecca. The journalist had connections everywhere. Connections in corporate offices, in executive assistance networks, in the kind of places where information flowed like currency. One call. That's all it took. One call to his office, pretending to be a luxury hotel representative, calling about an exclusive membership opportunity, and suddenly she had access to his personal line. The gatekeepers had crumbled. Power, she'd learned, opened doors for those who wielded it convincingly. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. 3 weeks of waiting, 3 weeks of wondering if he'd seen the video, 3 weeks of knowing that Rebecca's footage had gone viral, that his lawyers were already in damage control mode, that the world was beginning to ask questions about Marcus Sterling's past. Now it was time to make him answer. She dialed. He answered on the second ring. "Yes?" His voice was exactly as she remembered it from those Thursday nights, cold, impatient, dismissive. The voice of a man who'd never had to wait for anything, who'd never been kept on hold, who'd never been made to feel small. She was about to change that. "Mr. Sterling," Emma said, keeping her voice professional and steady, letting the rage simmer beneath the surface where he couldn't quite detect it. "I'm calling on behalf of a private matter. It concerns someone from your past." There was a pause. She could almost hear him calculating. Risk assessment, legal implications, how much this might cost him. "I don't have time for—" "My mother's name was Simone Rodriguez," Emma interrupted, her voice cutting through his dismissal like a knife. "Room 412, the Peninsula Hotel, 23 years ago." The line went silent. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20. Emma could hear him breathing on the other end, could feel his entire world tilting. "Who is this?" His voice had changed completely. The coldness was still there, but now it was wrapped around something else. Fear, terror even. The sound of a man whose carefully constructed reality was beginning to crack. "Someone you need to talk to," Emma said, "in person. Today, your penthouse, 6 p.m. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. It was the first authentic emotion she'd ever heard from him. "This is a scam. I'm hanging up." "Yes, you do," Emma said, "and you're going to listen to me, because if you don't, everything, your reputation, your business, your life, is going to burn." I have evidence, I have witnesses, I have a journalist who's already recorded your confession, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to be at your penthouse at 6 p.m., alone, and you're going to listen to what I have to say, or by tomorrow morning, the world is going to know exactly what you are." She hung up before he could respond. At 5:47 p.m., Emma stood in the lobby of his building. The marble floors gleamed under expensive lighting. Everything about this place screamed wealth and power and untouchability. But Emma no longer believed in those things. She'd learned that wealth was just another form of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of exposure, fear of facing consequences like an ordinary human being. She'd chosen her clothes carefully. The black waitress uniform. Not because she was working, because it was armor, because it reminded her of every moment she'd served him invisible, of every time he'd looked through her like she was part of the furniture, of every tip he'd left without making eye contact. Because it was a weapon, a physical reminder of exactly who she was and why she was here. The security guard at the desk barely glanced at her. To him, she was invisible too, just another service worker moving through the building. The elevator ride up was the longest of her life. 42 floors. In each second, her confidence flickered. What if he didn't recognize her? What if he denied everything? What if he called his lawyers and had her arrested for extortion? What if he decided to run, to disappear, to hide somewhere his money could protect him? The elevator doors opened. Marcus Sterling stood in the doorway of his penthouse. He looked older than he did in the restaurant, smaller somehow, despite his expensive suit and the tailored perfection of his appearance. His eyes were red-rimmed. His face was gray. His hands were trembling. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, who'd spent the entire evening preparing for this moment and failing. His eyes scanned her face, searching for something. Recognition, confirmation, evidence of his own guilt staring back at him. "You," he whispered. "Me," Emma confirmed, stepping into his apartment. The penthouse was exactly what she'd expected. Minimalist, expensive, cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, modern art that cost more than she'd earn in a lifetime. Everything calculated to project power and control. The waitress, the one you never looked at. That's not... He stopped. His jaw clenched. He turned away from her, unable to face her directly. "Your mother, she was everything," Emma said, her voice steady but filled with rage that had been building for 20 years. "She was brilliant and kind, and she loved you even though you didn't deserve it. She raised me alone. She worked herself to death, literally, pneumonia, because she couldn't afford proper medical care, because you decided she wasn't worth helping." Marcus walked to the window, his back to her. His shoulders were hunched. For the first time, he looked vulnerable. "I gave her money." "You gave her $50,000 like it was trash," Emma said, her voice cutting across the silence of the penthouse. Like it was enough to erase her, to erase me. Well, it wasn't. I'm still here. I'm still her daughter. And I'm still yours. You can't buy your way out of that. You can't have your lawyers make me disappear. I exist, Marcus. And so did she. He didn't respond. He just stood there, looking out at the city, at the world he'd conquered and the lives he'd destroyed in the process. "Turn around," Emma said. "Look at me." He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that wasn't coldness. It was guilt. Raw, ancient guilt that he'd been burying for 2 decades. The weight of it was visible in every line of his face, in the way his body seemed to cave in on itself. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "The truth," Emma said. "I want you to acknowledge that I exist, that my mother existed. That you destroyed her life and you've spent 20 years pretending it never happened. I want you to say it, out loud, no lawyers, no prepared statements, just the truth." "You're right," Marcus said, and the admission seemed to cost him something, as if he was physically expending energy to speak the words. "I did, and I've regretted it every single day since. Every single day I think about her, about you, about the life I could have had if I'd been brave enough to be different." But what?" Emma's voice was sharp as a blade. "But there are others," Marcus said slowly, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep inside him, from some place he'd sealed off and hidden away years ago. "Other women, other children. You're not the first person to come here and tell me I've destroyed their life. You won't be the last." Emma felt her stomach drop. "What?" 17, he said flatly. "I've paid off 17 women over the past 30 years, some for paternity suits, some just to keep quiet. Some I threatened with lawyers in isolation. I've been covering it up my entire career. I've built an empire on the backs of women I used and then discarded like they were nothing." The confession hung in the air between them like a physical thing, like something solid and real that couldn't be taken back. Emma could feel the weight of it. 17 women, 17 stories, 17 lives disrupted by one man's selfishness and cowardice. "You need to turn yourself in," Emma said, "to the authorities, to the media. You need to tell the world what you've done." "I will lose everything," Marcus said. "My company, my reputation, my freedom." "Good," Emma said coldly. "You deserve to." But then she saw it, a flicker of something in his face. Not just guilt anymore, something that looked almost like relief, like he'd been carrying this weight so long that finally, he wanted to put it down. Like the thought of consequences was almost a comfort compared to the endless burden of pretending. What neither of them knew was that Rebecca had been outside the penthouse the entire time. What they didn't know was that she'd recorded everything through the floor-to-ceiling windows with a telephoto lens. Rebecca stood in the street below, her camera capturing every moment, every confession, every tear that began to fall down Marcus Sterling's face. And what Emma absolutely didn't know was that Marcus had been expecting this confrontation, not with her specifically, but with someone. Because the truth was, he'd already decided to confess. He had already hired the lawyers. He'd already prepared the statement. All he'd been waiting for was permission. All he'd been waiting for was someone to force him to face what he'd been running from. And now that person was here, standing in his penthouse in a waitress uniform, reminding him that some debts can't be paid with money. Some debts require your entire life. Pause for a moment. Comment on what you think should happen next. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell. Your voice matters. May your heart be guided with wisdom and courage. The next morning, the video was everywhere. Emma woke up to her phone exploding. Text after text, call after call. Rebecca had uploaded everything at 6 a.m. The footage of Emma and Marcus in the penthouse, his confession about the 17 women, the audio of him admitting to decades of deception. By 9 a.m., it had 5 million views. By noon, every news station in the country was running the story. Billionaire admits to fathering 17 children, abandons all of them. The headlines were brutal. The comments were brutal. The internet had already decided Marcus Sterling's fate, but Marcus wasn't answering calls. He wasn't posting statements. He'd gone silent. That terrified Emma more than anything else could have. Rebecca found her at a coffee shop downtown. The journalist slid into the seat across from her, her expression grim. "He's lawyering up," Rebecca said. "His team is already working damage control. They're calling it a hoax. They're saying the video was deep-faked. He confessed," Emma said flatly. "I heard him." "So did I," Rebecca said. "But his lawyers are arguing that you coerced him, that you threatened him, that the confession was made under duress. They're building a case to make you look like the villain." Emma felt something inside her break. After everything, after all of this, he was still going to slip away. He was still going to use his money and his lawyers and his power to escape. She stood up. "Then I'm done. Let him burn his way out. I don't care anymore." Rebecca grabbed her wrist. "Wait, there's something else, something bigger." "I don't want to hear it," Emma said. "One of the other women," Rebecca continued, ignoring her, "one of the 17, she's his ex-CFO. She has records, financial documents, proof that he's been using company funds to pay off the women. We're talking embezzlement, tax fraud, wire fraud. This isn't just a personal scandal anymore, Emma. This is federal crime." Emma sat back down slowly. "How do you know this?" "She reached out to me this morning," Rebecca said. "She saw the video. She's been waiting 20 years for someone else to come forward. She wants to testify. She wants Marcus in prison." "Why would she trust you?" Emma asked. "Because," Rebecca said, "I have a reputation for protecting sources, and because she saw what you did. She saw you standing up to him, and she realized she could do it too." Emma's phone buzzed. Another text, another news alert, another layer of the story unraveling. She opened her messages and found one from an unknown number. "Emma, this is Marcus. I need to see you. Not with lawyers, not with the media, just you and me, please, before I make my next move. You owe me that much." She showed it to Rebecca. "It's a trap," Rebecca said immediately. "Don't go." But Emma wasn't sure, because something in those words felt genuine. Something in the plea felt like the crack in the armor she'd been waiting for. She texted back, "Where?" The response came 30 seconds later. "The Peninsula Hotel, room 412, noon, tomorrow, come alone." "No," Rebecca said firmly, "absolutely not." "He confessed to you," Emma said quietly. "He told you about the 17 women. He told you about the embezzlement. He was going to turn himself in, and then the video dropped, and everything changed. His lawyers got involved, and suddenly he's denying everything." "People do that," Rebecca said. "They crack, and then they rebuild. It doesn't mean—" "What if it means he's finally done running?" Emma interrupted. "What if he's actually ready to face this?" "Then he can face it in court," Rebecca said, "without you." But Emma had already made her decision. She'd spent her entire life chasing this moment. She'd spent every day preparing for it. And now, when she was finally close to something real, she wasn't going to let it slip away because of fear. "I'm going," Emma said. What Emma didn't know was that Marcus had already called the FBI. What she didn't know was that federal agents were already in the hotel, already setting up surveillance. What she didn't know was that Marcus had recorded his own confession, a second one, even more damning than the first, specifically for the investigators. And what neither Rebecca nor Emma knew was that Marcus had made a choice the night before, a choice that would either save his soul or destroy it completely. Because in that penthouse, after Emma had left, after the video had dropped, after his lawyers had told him he could potentially beat this, Marcus had called his therapist, he'd called his priest, he'd called every person who'd ever believed he was capable of being better than this. And then he'd made a decision that would cost him everything. He was going to confess, not to save his reputation, not to minimize his sentence, but because for the first time in his life, he was tired of running. And sometimes the only way forward is to stop. Noon, the Peninsula Hotel, room 412. Emma stood outside the door for 3 minutes before knocking. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was it, the moment everything either ended or transformed. She knocked. Marcus answered immediately, like he'd been waiting right there. He looked like he hadn't slept. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His eyes were red-rimmed. He looked like a man who'd finally stopped running and realized how exhausted he was. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Emma said, stepping inside the room. The same room where, 23 years ago, he and her mother had created her. "You're right," Marcus said. He gestured to the chair by the window. "Please, sit." They sat in silence for a moment. Emma could hear the city outside, the traffic, the hum of millions of lives happening without them. "I've made some choices," Marcus said finally. "Choices I need to explain to you before the world knows." "I'm listening," Emma said. "I called the FBI this morning," Marcus said. "I gave them everything. The financial records, the names of all 17 women, the documentation of the embezzlement, the wire fraud, all of it. I'm going to plead guilty. I'm going to prison, Emma, likely for a very long time." Emma felt something shift inside her. She'd wanted this, hadn't she? She'd wanted him to face consequences. She'd wanted justice. But now that it was happening, all she felt was hollow. "Why?" she asked. "Because," Marcus said, looking directly at her, "your mother was right. I was a coward, and cowards don't get to keep what they've stolen. I built my empire on the backs of women I used and abandoned. I fathered 17 children and pretended they didn't exist. I've spent my entire life running from that truth." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "But you came into my life," he continued, "and you made me stop running. You stood in my penthouse, and you told me that your mother existed. That you existed. That I couldn't just erase you with money and silence." "So what?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "You're going to prison, and that makes it okay?" "Nothing makes it okay," Marcus said. "Nothing will ever make it okay. But at least it's something. At least it's an acknowledgement that I was wrong, that you mattered. He turned back to her and she saw something in his face she'd never seen before. Not pride, not arrogance, humility, genuine, devastating humility. I set up trusts, Marcus said, for all 17 children, $500 million split among them. It's not an apology. Money can't apologize. But it's a start. And I've written letters to each of them, to each of their mothers, explaining everything, no excuses, just the truth. Emma felt tears sliding down her face. She wasn't sure if they were tears of anger or relief or something she didn't have a name for. Your mother, Marcus said softly. She raised you alone. She sacrificed everything for you. And I want you to know that I see that now. I see her now. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Emma stood up. She was shaking. She walked to him and for a moment, she thought about hitting him. For a moment, she thought about screaming. For a moment, she thought about walking out and never looking back. Instead, she said, "You need to say that to the other 16 families." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm going to, one by one, in person. Before I turn myself in, I owe them that." "And then?" Emma asked. "And then I go to prison," Marcus said, "and I spend the rest of my life understanding what I've done. And I hope, I don't expect it, but I hope, that someday you and the others can forgive me. Not because I deserve it, but because forgiveness is better for you than holding on to this anger." Emma looked at him, really looked at him, and she realized something. He wasn't the invincible billionaire anymore. He was just a man, broken, guilty, finally willing to face what he'd done. "You're going to help them," Emma said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marcus said. "I've already started. The FBI gave me 2 weeks before they formally charged me. I'm using that time to contact every woman, every child, to tell them the truth, to set up their trusts, to begin making amends." "Good," Emma said. She walked to the door, then paused. "My mother," she said, "used to say that redemption isn't about erasing what you've done. It's about finally seeing what you've done and choosing to be different." "Your mother was a wise woman," Marcus said. "She was," Emma said. And then, for the first time, she smiled at him. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. The thing she'd come here for all along. 6 months later, Marcus Sterling pleaded guilty in federal court. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. His empire was dismantled. His wealth was redistributed. But something unexpected happened. The other 16 women came forward. Not with anger, but with their own stories. And in telling those stories, they healed. They formed a support group. They started a foundation to help other women and children abandoned by wealthy men. They transformed their pain into purpose. And Emma? She finished her college degree. She became a social worker, helping women in situations like her mother had been in. She visited Marcus in prison every month, not out of forgiveness, but out of a commitment to his transformation. She held him accountable. She made sure he understood every single day the weight of what he'd done. One day during a visit, Marcus asked her, "Do you think your mother would be proud?" Emma thought about it, about Simone's strength, about her sacrifice, about her final wish that her daughter refused to disappear. "Yes," Emma said, "I think she would be." And in that moment, something that had been broken for 23 years began to heal. Not completely, not perfectly, but finally, genuinely, in a way that mattered. Because sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about acknowledgement. It's about standing up and saying, "You mattered. Your pain was real. Your existence was worth something." And sometimes that's enough to change everything. If this story touched you, leave a comment sharing the lesson you learned, subscribe for more, and turn on notifications. I pray for peace, hope, and blessings to fill your day.